So hello, everybody. This is an intro to sexual violence. I am Alex. I am an advocate at the NWA Center for Sexual Assault, and then also going to be doing a presentation specifically on childhood sexual abuse and grooming techniques is Melanie, and she's a community outreach coordinator with the Children's Advocacy Center. So my presentation is going to be more of just an intro into sexual violence and what that means and what it can entail. And to be completely honest, most of these things could have hour to 2 hour to day-long presentations on themselves, but it's also important to just have these ideas and some of these definitions floating in your heads. So I want to start just talking about what the NWA Center for Sexual Assault is. So our goal is to provide a safe space and a safe haven for adult survivors of sexual violence. This also includes secondary survivors, so loved ones, friends, family members, people who also might be experiencing trauma from the sexual violence that the survivor experienced. And ultimately, our mission is a world free of sexual assault. We know that is not the case right now. So until that happens, we want a world where every survivor is believed and every perpetrator is held accountable, and we want to help in that. And if you see on the right side of the screen, all of these, we have 5 different outreach groups. So GRACE is what I'm with, and that's specifically outreach to faith-based communities, because we know when people experience trauma, something like sexual trauma, they can turn to faith and they can turn to communities that they trust. And Let's Talk is outreach specifically to the Black community in Northwest Arkansas. And this also focuses more on domestic violence, while Project Arch is focused on the LGBTQI community, and KKMI down here, the blue circle, is for the Marshallese community, and then EC is for the bilingual Spanish-speaking community. And we have all these different outreaches because we know that sexual violence, even though there's like similar tactics or methods, which I'll go into in a few minutes, that all communities handle it differently and deal with it differently. And so it's important that we recognize that. And before we begin even talking about any of this stuff, I know this is virtual and I know you all are listening to it, but I wanted to throw out some group agreements. And if your professor or you all as a group decide to add some or edit some a little bit, that's totally fine. But I want to start out by saying what's said here stays here, but what is learned here leaves here. So if people share stories or experiences, if there is group discussion on this, don't go out and tell the world what other people are saying about themselves or personal experiences, but the definitions and the rapist typology, things like that, it leaves the space. It impacts your actions outside of this. And then that goes with the take space, make space. So if you find yourself answering a lot of questions or leading the discussion a lot, sometimes take a step back and give that space to someone else. And then show up and be present. I know this can be difficult because this is online and this is over a virtual world, but I'm asking that to the best of your ability that this is going to be a fairly quick presentation from both of us, that you're with us and you participate however your professor wants you to. And then use I statements. So back up to what's said here stays here. Make sure what's said here is stuff that pertains to you and you're not sharing other people's experiences or possible trauma. And all questions are encouraged, and our contact information will be at the end. So you can also feel free to ask either of us questions, but we learn by asking questions. So even if it feels silly or like something we might have already gone over, totally feel free to ask. And then one of them that I think is most important is care for each other and yourself. These topics can be really, really heavy, and especially when we get into grooming topics too. We don't know what anyone's been through, especially in your class or anyone who might be participating in this presentation. So if you need to pause this or take a step away from your laptop or from what we're talking about, do that to take care of yourself. But I ask that when you're ready and you're able to, please come back. And if you know of a classmate or a friend who is participating in this and they might relate to any of these topics, please check in on them and just make sure they're okay. So those are the group agreements. I am going to assume if you're watching this, we're all on the same page. So before we even get into sexual violence, I want to throw out some basic definitions about consent. So consent is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, specific. This means that someone is aware of everything that's going to happen, aware of all possible outcomes, that they are, like I said, fully informed, and that there's nothing stopping them from saying no, and there's nothing forcing them to say yes, that it's their own mind and their own free will. And then on the opposite of that, consent is not assumed, implied, coerced, or convinced. And this will be gone into further with sexual violence. But I think it's important to start off with these basic definitions and understanding of consent, because how can we fully understand sexual violence if we don't understand what the opposite of sexual violence is, or like what makes something sexual violence? So feel free to come back to this part. This is a very popular, the phrase is a very popular consent. It's from Planned Parenthood. So basic definition of sexual violence. It's someone who uses force or manipulation into unwanted sexual activity or interactions without the other party or party's consent. It can be anything from sexual acts, sexual touching, comments. It could be catcalling, street harassment, explicit images sent over social media or private messages. And there's a multitude of reasons why someone might not be able to consent, but a lot of the big ones can include fear, age, illness, disability, the use of drugs and alcohol. So all of these different things can impact someone's willingness or ability to consent. And then with that too, this presentation will get into it a little bit, but also identity in society can impact how people might coerce and use fear and use that to get what they want in a sexual situation. So, breakdown of sexual violence. These are kind of the three broader categories that we think about sexual violence in. And of course, there's a lot of nuanced and different things that go into this. That's just like stalking, like I said, to internet harassment. But these kind of three ideas are what we talk about or we see in the news, or like in general, if you say these statements to people, they're kind of familiar with them. So first is sexual harassment. This is just any unwanted sexual attention. It can be your living space or work is dependent on a sexual engagement, or it's as simple as if someone is unnecessarily and unwantingly touching you, kissing, stroking, or if they continually are trying to date you and they're trying to convince you to go on dates with them, even if someone keeps saying no and someone else keeps persisting. These fall under sexual harassment, and then tied into that can be gender harassment. And we see this a lot specifically when we talk about sexual harassment in the workplace. And this can be commentary on where women should be, not a dress code of what women can wear, but making commentary about the sexual appearance of someone's dress and things of that nature. And then we go into sexual assault. This is just an umbrella term for unwanted sexual contact. It's most often used interchangeably with rape, but a lot of times you'll hear that not all rape is sexual assault, but all or any rape that happens falls under sexual assault, but not all sexual assault falls under rape. Rape has very specific definitions. And if anyone's interested in legal definitions, feel free to contact me because I've done a lot of research on them. But rape specifically has to do with penetration of legally of a penis and vagina. In most states, that's what the definition is. And so sexual assault allows for a wider understanding of what rape or sexual assault could be, with penetration of objects or different unwanted touching or different forms of sex that people have or that people force others to have with them. And then we go into childhood sexual abuse, which my co-presenter is going to go more into. But it's any sexual activity between a minor and adult, and sexual abuse most often happens to minors, and this includes molesting, touching, assaulting. We also often see picture taking, picture sharing, or people forcing someone to watch videos or images. But these are kind of the three main categories that we break down sexual violence into. So just some basic stats. The one on the left is gotten from RAINN, which is a great resource if you ever want more information on sexual violence and stats around sexual assault. But every 73 seconds, someone is sexually assaulted. So less than every minute and a half, someone is sexually assaulted, which I ask you all to just really sit with that for a second and think about how prevalent sexual violence is. And then 1 in 6 Americans have been the victim of attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. And with men, it's about 1 in 33. And an important thing about those stats is that it is attempted or completed rape. And like I said, rape has a very specific definition. And I've taken a whole class specifically about if people want to call it rape and what that means psychologically. When we break these numbers down into just sexual violence in general, the numbers become a lot smaller. So with men, when it's just sexual violence in general, some of the stats are as low as 1 in 6 men have experienced sexual violence attempts in their lifetime. So that's also important to acknowledge, that rape specifically is going to have bigger numbers. And then 73% of adult survivors knew their perpetrators, and 90% of child survivors knew the offender. I added these because one of the notions that the center tries to break down is that it's the stranger in the bush that comes out and attacks somebody. Most of the time, sexual violence has to do with someone who knows somebody because they're using things that they know about someone's life to manipulate, to gain access to them, which is an important aspect of understanding sexual violence. And if you work with survivors ever in life, or if you work with perpetrators, what that means. And then this is specifically on verbal sexual coercion. This is one that I think we often forget or kind of push to the side, because verbal coercion is something we see constantly in day-to-day life. It's your basic everyday peer pressure, like convincing a friend to go out to the bars with you who doesn't want to, or convincing someone to do something they don't want to do. This is tactics that we see. And so then when we add the sexual coercion aspect to it, I pulled definitions from psychology departments across the country and different national violence prevention agencies across the country to kind of show you how they're all similar, but they all use slightly different language. So basically, verbal sexual coercion is non-physical tactics that use psychological pressure, such as being tricked, threatened, or non-physical force into some form of sexual contact. So what does this mean? This looks like any type of verbal pressure. It can be someone who they're in a relationship and someone's saying, well, if you won't sleep with me, that means you don't love me. Or questioning someone's sexuality if they don't want to have sex in the moment. Lying about things, or lying about if someone's been tested or if they're clean of different STIs. It's just using different tactics of manipulation to get to that sexual contact and that sexual interaction. All of these, I'm going to play this video. It's about verbal sexual coercion. It's just a quick, I think it's less than a minute, just to kind of put it into context.
But I said yes.
You can change your mind, you know. Saying yes once, twice, or even many times before doesn't mean it's a yes right now. Consent can be taken back at any time. It must be actively clear and never implied. It's not your fault.
But I said yes.
Hey, come on. My ex would do this with me, so why won't you? If you loved me, you would. Sexual coercion is when someone keeps asking after hearing no, or tries to turn your no into a yes. It's a form of sexual assault. And if you're not into it, it's not your fault.
But I said yes.
Nobody has the right to take advantage, even if you use drugs or alcohol. If you're passed out, you're not able to give informed consent. It's not your fault.
But I said yes.
Consent can never be given under pressure. If someone has given you an ultimatum, tricked you, or manipulated you, and you said the words yes, that's not consent. If you said yes, it's not your fault.
But the link to this video will be in the email and the sharing presentation. Okay, so more about verbal sexual coercion, specifically some stats. And if anyone wants access to these resources, contact me and I can give you specific studies, because I know that some people like knowing where numbers come from. So 70% of college students that were surveyed said that they had experienced verbal sexual coercion. And then of that 70% said that their perpetrator was actually their partner. So this goes back to what I was saying about most often it's sexual violence happens with people that are known to the survivor, because it's either that they're in the same space as them or that they know things about them to be able to convince them to do something. And then with that, 33% of college students surveyed admitted to coercing someone. And then 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual coercion in their lifetime, and then more than 1/3 were younger than 15. So this also relates to that childhood sexual abuse and what that means of using age to force and coerce something. And then to kind of break down the stereotype that men don't experience violence, across surveys on various college campuses, about 20 to 25% of men said that they had been coerced into having sex. This directly combats that 1 in 33 attempted rapes too, when we expand it to sexual violence or broader terms of sexual violence. 20 to 25% is a lot of people. So all of the information I just shared and the video that I attempted to share, but it didn't quite work, relates to power and control. I really want to hammer in that sexual violence is not about sex. Sexual violence is about power and control. It's about obtaining control over someone's life by using various forms of power. And so that relates to the power and control wheel. This is a general one. It's used for domestic violence, sexual violence, various forms of abuse. Specifically, of course, it relates to sexual violence, and it's important to note that sexual violence crosses over into multiple forms of abuse, because it's a weapon used in anything from physical abuse to spiritual abuse, emotional abuse. So keep that in mind too, that people who experience multiple forms of abuse have most likely experienced sexual violence. But the power and control wheel talks about different ways that power and control are obtained. So it can be, which these are really interesting, and there's a couple other wheels that I have after this that focus on different identities, but it can be threatening to use children as a means to share a message, or it can be stopping someone from going to a job, or if someone provides somebody money, it can be cutting off that money until they do what you want. It can be isolation, of cutting off all of someone's friends and not letting them interact with people or their family members. And then male privilege, I think, is interesting and an important one to point out, about how the societal power that we have impacts people's ability to enact violence on others. So it can look like a male partner telling someone that they need to act a certain way or be a certain way, and if they don't, it means this about them, or even not letting them if they don't, forcing them to be a certain way. And sexual assault is sometimes tied into that for what someone views in a woman partner. And then next, we go into, this is the power and control wheel again, because I'm really trying to hammer in, like I said, sexual violence is about power and control. So this is for immigrant women, and it has kind of the same basic pie pieces, but the examples underneath are different. So one prominent one is using citizenship or residency to manipulate and abuse somebody. And this can look like taking paperwork away that someone might need. This can look like calling different agencies and taking back any paperwork that they filed. Or this can be using someone's individual status to manipulate somebody. And then this also goes with like the isolation. You stop someone from speaking their native language. You don't let them see friends and family that might not be in the country that they're currently living in. And using children is a little bit different in this one too. This can be threatening to take children away. So this again relates back to perpetrators of violence usually know the people that they're picking out as victims and they use things about them and about their lives to achieve that. And then next, this has to do with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people. And we see heterosexism on the outside, and transphobia and homophobia, and these bigger ideas of like hate against these different groups impacting the ability for sexual violence to occur. And again, it looks a little bit different with these identities because it can look like threatening to out somebody. A survivor of sexual violence who falls into the LGBTQI community, the biggest fear about coming forward and seeking help is fear of being outed. And so that's a huge tactic that people use. This can also look like preventing access to medical care or different medications that someone might need, or even hiding or throwing away medications, or different paperwork, or hiding appointment times and things like that. Preventing access to clothing that someone might be most comfortable in. So all of these ideas about how, again, someone knows something about someone that they want to achieve sexual contact with, and so they use those to manipulate them into getting what they want. And a lot of times some of this stuff falls into the verbal sexual coercion that we don't always think about using our words to manipulate someone into doing something, because just because someone is saying yes doesn't mean it's yes, because a yes has to be enthusiastic, not forced, fully informed. And so then breaking down, when we look at power and control, so I'm going to break down the types of rapists, and this relates to sexual violence kind of in general. So we have 75% of rapists fall under the power category. They find people that are usually their age that seem vulnerable and accessible. And this is someone who wants to feel a sense of power and control specifically. They have fears about their worth and their sexuality, and to make themselves feel better, they use sexual assault to assert their heterosexuality and their strength. These survivors often don't have a lot of physical injuries because that's not the goal of a power assault. These survivors are sometimes not always believed, again, because they're not always showing cuts and bruises like some of the other survivors. Something interesting about this group, though, is these offenders usually admit to having some kind of sexual interaction, but they believe it was consensual. So this also relates back to this idea of how we understand consent in society and what that means for people's ability to perpetrate. Then we have 22% of rapists are anger, the category. This offender's goal is to hurt and debase the victim. Rape is the ultimate weapon. It's worse than death or murder. They use either an overconfident way of approaching people or kind of a surprise attack style. The people they choose to assault are just objects to them. They're interchangeable. The assaults are fairly quick and out of the blue. These survivors, like compared to the power ones, have more external and physical injuries and tend to be more believed because of those external injuries. And then lastly, we have sadistic with only 3%. These offenders go after people that they view as promiscuous, so it usually ends up being sex workers. They find the abuse and maltreatment of their victim gratifying, so they want to see someone who is suffering and helpless and in distress. Oftentimes, the people who experience this type of assault don't survive, and if they do, they have the most severe mental health struggles, and they have the highest rates of suicide. So we have this range, and of course, like, some people might not be in one category perfectly or exactly. They might flow in between or kind of be in between one or two. But if we look at all three of these, a thing that all three of them have is, like I mentioned, it's about power and control. It's about asserting power for the perpetrator to feel a certain way about themselves. It's not about sexual gratification. And so then how do we get to these big ideas of sexual violence, and how have we started to almost accept them into society? Because some of those numbers, 1 in 6 attempted rapes, 1 in 33 attempted or completed rapes. Those are huge numbers, and that's just one category of assault. And so if we added like catcalling or explicit images online or anything else, those numbers would be more and more people. So this relates to rape culture. This is a culture in which sexual violence is considered normal or almost accepted, and people aren't taught not to assault, but they're taught not to be assaulted. And this directly ties into victim blaming, which is this idea that someone who experiences violence is responsible for the violence they experience. They could have not been at the bar that night. They could have not been talking to the stranger online. Did they say something to make someone feel that way or do that? Like, what did they do to bring the violence upon themselves? And I'm just going to show, heads up, there is some images on the next page that kind of relate to this ad. It's about ad media and how these ideas are kind of ingrained in us almost, or not ingrained, but all around us is what I'm looking for. So this is an ad from the 60s. I believe it was for a broomstick. I don't know about you all. Nothing about this ad says broomstick to me. It doesn't make sense if you think that's what it's for. But yeah, looking at this ad, this was 6 decades ago. So it's kind of like, oh, okay, like times have changed. Well, these are all ads from the last decade. Most of them are fashion ads. So like we have 2 clothing ads and then we have watch ads. When we look at the position that women are put in and how the body and sexual violence is being used to sell these products, what does that mean for our acceptance of these forms of violence? And then the one that I want to point out the most is this one in the bottom right that says she couldn't say no. This is an anti-assault ad, actually. And their way of sharing their anti-assault message was to say that someone had had too much alcohol, so they made bad decisions, and that is why they got assaulted. Which anti-assault PSAs are, right, they're unnecessary in life, but this shows how even someone who's trying to spread a good message can still fall into the narrative of victim blaming and might not be sharing it in the best way. We will send the link to this video because this video is actually really interesting, and it just relates to rape culture in general, and it's kind of a satirical video, a little bit more lighthearted, but it points out the almost ridiculousness to telling people, well, if you make yourself look a certain way or act a certain way, you won't get assaulted. And it's all these different things that people have said about, like, well, dress this way, do this, don't be around strangers, but your friends can also perpetrate all these different things. And we will share that video in the email.
Being in college or just about anywhere is dangerous. By following these simple steps, you can avoid getting raped. Short skirts make you an easy target. Try wearing clothing that's not easy to remove, like jumpsuits, overalls, or by adding belts. Ponytails and long hair are easy to grab, so choose your hairstyle wisely. Remember, your choice of footwear can make the difference between getting raped or getting away. Always bring a friend when you go out, and tell them where you're going at all times. Or always bring a dog. Choose your venue wisely. No one will hear you scream for help at a loud club. Also, beware of bathrooms. Many attacks occur there. Always keep your drink in your hand, and keep a hand on top so no one can slip something in it. Don't take drinks from anyone. It's better to be rude than to get raped. And remember, don't get drunk. Beware of vans. They're the #1 rapist vehicle. If you encounter a rapist in your car, drive into a lamppost or a dumpster. Or if you're in the passenger seat, don't be afraid to jump out of a moving car. Remember, anything can be used as a weapon. Tell your attacker that you have a disease or are menstruating. Vomiting and urinating may also deter an attacker. Fight like a psychotic cat. It's better to seem crazy than get raped. Also, leave a mark on your rapist to make it easier for him to be caught later. Make eye contact with a potential attacker. Don't make eye contact with a potential attacker. Don't put yourself in a situation where you can be raped. Avoid isolation. Avoid walking alone. Avoid poorly lit areas. Avoid elevators with a lone stranger. Avoid giving a guy blue balls. Remember, rape isn't just committed by strangers, but friends, relatives, and colleagues. So follow these tips to lower the chances of rape occurring, because just being aware won't save you from getting raped.
And so this is just a list of a bunch of different things that are a part of sexual violence. So we have anything from stalking, coercion, power and control, technology, just general sexual abuse, sexual exploitation from helping professionals, intimate partner sexual violence, sexual harassment. All of these different things are a part of sexual violence. This is just some of the things. There is a bunch more, but I just wanted to throw some up on the screen because I have a couple scenarios after this. So feel free to read through these. And then for the scenarios, I'll read them out loud for people who might process better by hearing. And then you all can either pause. I'll give like a 5-second pause myself, and then I'll go to the slide explaining what was not good about it. So scenario 1, Blake and Taylor just recently started having sex. Things are going great. Both of them are open and honest with each other, and Taylor is particularly impressed with Blake's performance in bed. Taylor's been bragging to their friends about Blake and wants to show proof of Blake's skills. So Taylor hides a camera in the bedroom and tapes them having sex. Blake is unaware of the camera. What forms of sexual violence are present? So in scenario 1, Taylor is engaging in sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, and showing of one's genitals/naked body without consent. Taylor is taking sexual advantage of Blake for their own benefit by tricking Blake into documenting their sexual activity. In doing so, Taylor is also violating a requirement of sexual consent. Blake does not have the ability to get fully informed consent because Taylor has created a scenario in which Blake does not have full knowledge of what is happening. So this relates back to the very beginning with that consent definition, that part of consent is that someone is fully informed and aware of their options and decisions and what's happening. And of course, there might be other things that you all notice. So if you all notice more, feel free to discuss and engage those. Scenario 2. Sierra and Matt have been together for 6 months, and Sierra believes that Matt is ready to have sex. One night, they went out for a romantic dinner and afterwards to Matt's apartment. They were watching a movie when Sierra decided to make a move. Matt, still not ready, says no. As the night went on, Sierra kept trying to convince him that he was ready. Sierra started asking if he really loved her, because if he did, he wouldn't say no. She even started asking if he was gay and if he was really into girls, because if he was, he wouldn't say no. After continual comments and questions, Matt stopped saying no and went silent. Sierra took that as a yes, and they have sex. What forms of sexual violence are present? In scenario 2, Sierra is engaging in verbal sexual coercion, manipulation, and sexual assault. Sierra is questioning Matt's love, connection, and sexuality by implying it is not real or true. Matt does not have sex with Sierra, and they have sex without communicated consent. This violates 2 requirements of sexual consent. In hoping that Matt will give in to the advances, Sierra is violating the requirements for sexual consent to be freely given, and choosing to interpret Matt's silence as yes and having sex, and violates the requirement for consent to be clearly communicated. And I would also throw in that consent is supposed to be enthusiastic. So even if at some point Matt had been like, yeah, sure, we can do it, that's a situation that if someone is ever a part of, question it and kind of be like, I'm hearing a no in that yes, let's talk about it. And then last scenario, scenario 3, a group of students routinely gather outside of their dorm to publicly rate the bodies of students passing by. When a student who they find attractive passes, they hold up a piece of paper with a 10 scribbled on it. When a student passes that the group doesn't find attractive, they hold up different numbers according to how they view them. People have tried to approach them, but the group always responds with some joke about, don't they dress like that for a reason? Eventually, many students start avoiding this dorm altogether and choosing instead to take a longer route to cafeteria, classes, health center, and so on. What forms of sexual violence are present? In scenario 3, the students who are rating their peers are engaging in sexual harassment and victim blaming. By commenting and rating their classmates, they're engaging in unwelcome sexual attention and commentary. The group also believes it is their responsibility to rate and comment because people must be asking for it with how they dress. The whole situation has caused many students to start avoiding their dorm or different areas because the environment is now hostile. They are interfering with the ability of their fellow students to easily attend class and participate in campus activities, and they are creating a climate in which many feel disrespected, objectified, and like it is their fault. And like I said again, all 3 of these scenarios might have additional forms of violence or sexual violence that you saw, and feel free to discuss and engage in those. And these are our contacts, so if you have questions about where any of our stats are from or any of our information, feel free to contact either of us. And that is the end of this presentation.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Alex. So yeah, you got to hear Alex really talk about kind of the different degrees of sexual violence that's out there. And the Northwest Arkansas Center for Sexual Assault really deals with adult victims and survivors. And so the difference with our center at the Children's Advocacy Center, Benton County, is we see children who are also victims and survivors of any form of maltreatment. So we don't just focus on sexual abuse. However, that's what we're going to talk about today. But we also do see children who've been affected by physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, even human trafficking, witnessing any sort of domestic violence. Pretty much anytime you can imagine a crime that involves a child, they are typically seen at our center. So even witnessing other crimes such as homicides or suicides, those children can be seen at our center as well. Our vision and our mission is very similar to the Center for Sexual Assault. We hope to see an end and a way to eliminate child abuse and be able to give children their childhood and innocence back. So really our center is meant to provide comprehensive services for kids. So when a report is made to the child abuse hotline, what we saw happening before CACs were created is they would have to go to the police station, which was really terrifying and traumatic for a child who associates police stations with criminals and only bad guys go there. And so every time they were interviewed there in a facility that wasn't necessarily child friendly, it just caused more trauma to the system. A lot of times our kids may be interviewed in their homes where the abuse may have occurred, or sometimes even in the schools. And schools is not always considered a safe place for a child. And so we needed to create a system and a process that would minimize the trauma during this investigative period. And so our center provides advocacy, forensic interviewing, medical exams, and counseling free of charge for the families. So what does child abuse look like? You heard Alex talk a lot about statistics with sexual assault in general, geared towards adults. And so for children, we see about 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. Something to keep in mind is that this statistic only focuses on sexual abuse. And so when we think about child abuse as a whole, there's so much other forms of maltreatment that aren't being captured in this statistic alone. We also know that a sex offender will molest an average of 120 victims. Most of those victims will never disclose their abuse in childhood. So that makes our jobs a bit complicated when children don't come forward. And so we really see education really twofold. Not only equipping adults to recognize and respond appropriately and report child abuse when they suspect it, but also to equip our children to understand body safety, to understand what those red flags are, but to also encourage them that when something happens, that they have the right to say no. They also have the right to go tell an adult, that it's not tattletaling on someone, but they're getting help. And so we really try hard to go out in the community, equip our professionals and our adults, but also equip our children to understand that this stuff happens, and that when it does, these are their options to get help and hopefully help it make it stop. So grooming there's a lot of dynamics with grooming. And this can be applied to adults as well and not just children. But there's two things with grooming. When we think of grooming, we always think of grooming the victim. But what our offenders do is they not only groom the victim, but they groom their environment. They groom the people around us, mostly so that when the victim chooses to disclose, the people they disclose to don't believe them. And that's their goal. And you can see at the end of grooming, their goal is to maintain control and secrecy. So they're going to target a victim, and that can look very different depending on the perpetrator, but they're going to gain their trust and fill a need. And for children, this can look different. You can see, let's imagine a school setting. You have a child who's eating alone in the lunchroom. And let's say the perpetrator, who maybe it's a teacher, comes up to the child and says, hey, I see that you're eating alone. That doesn't look like that's very fun. Why don't you come and eat with me in my classroom? And that way you don't have to eat by yourself. So if you take a moment to think about that and put yourself in that child's shoes, how would that make you feel? For a lot of kids, that makes them feel special. That makes them feel wanted. And so they're feeling in that need of, maybe it's a friend. Maybe they don't have friends, so they're going to fill in that best friend role. Maybe they lack a parent figure, so they come in and they try to fulfill that parent figure role. But what you notice in that scenario is that the teacher takes a child into a classroom. And so that's the next step of grooming, is isolating the child. Abuse happens behind closed doors, and this goes for adults as well. It does not happen out in the open where everyone can see. And so isolation is the biggest part of grooming. Sometimes when we think of the word grooming, we associate it to maybe small touches that grow and build over time. But isolation is the biggest part, because we don't see it happen. And so once the child is isolated, or any victim is isolated, that's when we see the sexualization of the relationship occur. Because again, it happens behind closed doors. What we know about offenders is the red flags to look for someone who's grooming a child is they're going to go to great lengths to isolate a child. A normal person who is not wanting to violate a child's boundaries would have seen that child eating alone in the lunchroom and would have offered that child to eat at a different table with some friends. It may have sounded something like, hey, I see that you're eating alone. Why don't we go sit at this table with some other kids, and maybe we can see if we can make some friends together. What they're going to do is connect that child with other children. And a perpetrator is going to connect that child to themselves. And so we're going to, again, look for those opportunities where they go to great lengths to isolate. And then, of course, to maintain control and secrecy. Obviously, the perpetrator doesn't want anyone to know about the relationship or what's going on. And so you heard Alex really talk about that power and control dynamic. She showed you that wheelhouse of what those different techniques can look like. That applies to kids as well. It just may look different. It may look like just telling the kid to keep it a secret, and if they do, they may hurt their family. So it can come in the form of threats, which we can see in those adult relationships as well. I think with child sexual abuse, that manipulation is a little bit easier because you are dealing with a child who is taught to obey adults and listen to adults. And so they don't always feel like they have the right to say no, or the right to not listen and do something different. And so that secrecy and control, that power dynamic is very similar. And so I wanted to share a little bit about what does this disclosure process look like? And this can apply for adults as well. Kids and adults, they can go through one of these stages. They can go through all of them. They can go through them in order. They can go through them out of order. It can look different for everyone because what we know about trauma is that it affects everyone differently. And so I like to talk about this. One, if you are around children or around other potential victims of abuse, it's good to know what to look for, because it's unlikely, like we saw in the statistic earlier, it's unlikely for especially children to come forward and just spit out and tell us everything that happened. They're going to give us clues, and they're going to share things here and there to see if we catch them. And so it's important that we know how to recognize them. But for a lot of kids and a lot of victims, they deny it. It's not them lying. It's them denying the abuse that happened. Kids are more likely to deny abuse than they are to make up allegations. And it can be for a lot of different reasons. It could be wanting to keep it a secret. It could be the fear of what will happen to them or their perpetrator or their family. And it could just be the shame of I didn't tell right when it happened, the shame of I should have told the first time, but it's been 6 months or 6 years later and I still haven't told, so who's going to believe me when I do? Most kids, when they are ready to tell, 77% are going to be tentative. Basically, that's sharing bits and pieces here and there. They're not sharing the whole story. They're testing the waters. If I share this information, what's going to happen? If I share this piece of information, what will happen? And so they're testing us, and they're processing all of that while they're testing. And then you do have the few who are active. They actively tell. They make the cognitive decision to disclose everything that's going on. A normal part of the process is recantation. About a quarter of our cases will recant at some point, and we have to educate our jury, educate our family members, and educate our community that this is normal. It's normal for kids and victims to take back those statements. It could be that once they disclose, they didn't realize the police were going to get involved. It could be when they disclose, they didn't realize they would have to go to court and testify, or that their family would be split apart and that the perpetrator would be taken to jail. Because most of the time they know who their perpetrator is, and most of the time it is the family member. So all of that pressure, all of those natural consequences could cause them to take back the statement and go back to how it was before, even if it means getting abused again, because at least to them, that's something they're familiar with. That's something to be expected, where this whole world of unknowns, they don't know what to expect, and that's more scary than the abuse sometimes. But what we do know is that when we give that safe environment and that support to those victims, 93% will reaffirm. So it's just a matter of continuing that support, continuing those relationships, giving them the tools they need to cope with that trauma, and most of them will reaffirm those allegations at some point. So just to talk a little about trauma, again, this goes for children and adults, because I think it's important to remember how victims react to a lot of the abuse that they endure. And I talk about this because it's so easy sometimes for society to hear a victim's story and to not believe them. And you heard in Alex's, when she talked about their mission and their purpose, is we want these victims to be believed. But sometimes their disclosures after the trauma don't sound believable. And so we try to educate people to understand how trauma affects those disclosures, how trauma affects that memory recall, because a lot of times that's not what we need to be relying on. There should be so much more to support that victim besides just their word. But what we know is that trauma can enhance or distort memory. Trauma releases a lot of hormones in the brain, and that affects a lot of how the memory is encoded, how it's stored, and then how it's retrieved later when they are ready to disclose about the abuse. It can shut down episodic memory. So basically what that means is there's two types of memory, episodic or script. Episodic is a one-time event. It sounds something like, this morning, I dropped my child off at daycare, and it was looking cloudy outside. And so today I brought my rain jacket just to make sure that when I dropped her off, that we didn't get wet. That's an episodic memory. You can hear that's a one-time event, that something different happened this morning. Script is something that happens all the time. And so that can sound something like, this morning I got up and I brushed my teeth, and then I usually go get dressed, and then I grab my kid and we drive off to go to daycare. You hear keywords like usually, and this is what we would do. That's implying that this is something that happens all the time. And so episodic memory is really important when investigators are trying to gather those details about the abuse, because they're looking for those one-time clues, those specific pieces of evidence that they can use. But they have to realize and know that a lot of times with trauma, it shuts down that episodic event. And so it makes it more challenging to get what they need to move forward. And that's okay. We just have to get creative and understanding how we can work better. But trauma with multiple traumatic experiences impairs memory, emotional regulation, and behavioral regulation. Think about when you're in a classroom setting and you would always have that one kid who was acting out, who was considered to be disrespectful and always causing a scene. We're really trying to educate our school system to not look at that as a kid who's bad, who's a troublemaker or rebellious, and not to look at that kid as to what's wrong with you, but to shift our mindset to look at those victims as what happened to you. Because trauma affects those behaviors. They don't know how to cope with those feelings they're dealing with. And so kids don't say to us, I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling nervous. They tell us their tummy hurts or that they have a headache or a stomach ache. Those are the key words we need to be seen, because they don't know how to communicate those feelings that they don't know how to process. And so they acted out. And so we need to recognize that as a reaction to trauma. And just very quickly, understand the hand-brain model. And so if you want to do this with me, if you will raise your right palm, and if you will fold your thumb over, and if you look at your wrist represents the base of the skull, the kind of the survival part of our brain. What that means is this part of our brain at your wrist, if your hand were to represent the brain, is if you touched a hot stove, your hand would retract. You wouldn't have to think about it, right? It's a survival instinct. That's the base part of our brain. Most reptiles have that part of their brain, a survival instinct. Now, if you looked at your thumb, that's folded over, just like in the picture. This is more of our limbic part of our brain. So this is our emotions. Most mammals have this part of the brain. So if you think about when you are aroused, or when you are angry, or when you are jealous or sad or happy, whatever that emotion can be, that's where your emotions come from, in this part of the brain. So if you take your forefingers and fold them over your thumb, like in the picture, this represents your prefrontal cortex. This is what makes us human. This is where our logic and our reasoning come together. So we talk about this a lot to communicate our feelings, because if our hand is folded over, if our lid is on, we are thinking logically, we are reasoning. But when we find ourselves in a situation, maybe when abuse is happening, maybe when we're triggered by a memory and we're thinking about something that was traumatic, if you raise your forefingers, your lid is flipped. And what that exposes is all of those emotions going on. And so if you can imagine those victims who are dealing with trauma, trying to figure out how to cope with it, when their lid is flipped, we cannot meet logic with logic, because our emotions are out there. And so we have to meet emotions with emotions until, if you put your forefingers down, till their lid is back on, can we then begin to reason with them. And so that's a great way and a great visual to use when we're trying to communicate feelings. Because for kids, when their lids are flipped, or when adults, when your lid is flipped, we have to find a way to regulate those emotions to get our lid back on, to think logically. For adults, I think a great example is when you're upset and someone tells you to calm down, And that usually does not work. And that's because our lid is flipped, and we can't think logically. We have to find tangible tools to calm down before we can get our lid back on. And so we just wanted to throw a little bit of those dynamics out there, about how talking about the varying degrees of sexual violence, but also talking about what those dynamics look like and how it affects those victims so that we can better serve them, and be better equipped to handle those situations. But I was able to get our contact information. So please, if you have any questions about what we talked about today, please reach out to Alex. She's with the Northwest Arkansas Center for Sexual Assault. Or you can reach out to myself, Melanie, who is with the Children's Advocacy Center of Benton County. And so we just wanted to both thank you for taking the time to listen about sexual violence. And like Alex said in the beginning, we hope that what you learned today doesn't stay here, and take that out, and equip others and educate others on how we can better serve these victims and better prevent these situations of abuse. So thank you.